Meeting to order. Today is Monday, May 11th, 2015. We're here for the purpose of a committee of the whole. I would ask that you all rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, Clerk Spencer, I'd ask that you call the roll.
Joyder.
Here.
Sabatino.
Here.
Leader.
Here.
Dunn.
Here.
Graham.
Here.
Polumsky.
Here.
York.
Here.
Toledo.
Here.
Healy. Absent. Levin.
Here.
Kennedy.
Here.
Honquist.
Here.
Wagner.
Here.
Mulliner.
Here.
14 present, 1 absent.
14.
I'm sorry, 13 present, 1 absent.
13 present, 1 absent. We have a quorum. We're not sure if Alderman Healy's going to make it. The photographer's going to stick around for 5 more minutes. If Alderman Healy does show up, we'll pause the meeting and do a quick photo shoot. But other than that, it looks like we'll be rescheduling the group shoot for another time. Any announcements at this time from the dais? Any announcements? Alderman Deuter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Alderman Sabatino and I wanted to invite all First Ward residents to a meeting at the library on Wednesday, May 20th at 7 o'clock. The meeting will be in the large meeting room on the first floor, and we are going to be introducing the ward's new alderman and having a discussion focused on our downtown area.
Okay, any other announcements? Seeing none, we'll move on to public comments. This is an opportunity for anybody in the audience to address the council on any item they so choose. Much like with our regular meetings of the City Council, we ask that you keep your comments to 3 minutes out of respect for the work that we have to do here and out of respect for other folks who may want to talk. We ask that you announce your name when you get up to the microphone, and addresses are optional. At this time, Clerk Spencer, is there anybody who has signed up for public comment?
At this time, and no one had signed up for public forum.
Okay, no one signed up on the sign-in sheet. Is there anybody in the audience who wishes to address the council that has not had an opportunity to sign in? Please raise your hand. Going once, going twice. That concludes public comments. Agenda item number 4, business before the committee. As all are aware, this is an ongoing project that we've been working on. This is a review of our strategic planning and goals. Greg Kuhn from Sikich is going to be leading us in this. But before I ask Mr. Sikich to get started, Mr. Kuhn, who would they say? Mr. Sikich? I don't think he's here. Before I ask Mr. Kuhn to get started, does anybody have any questions as it relates to this meeting? Let's a belt and suspenders sort of thing. I'm going to ask for a motion and a second to allow Mr. Kuhn to take part in the meeting with us. Motion by Alderman York, second by Alderman Deuter. We can do a voice vote. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay. At this point, I will turn the meeting over to Greg Kuhn from Sikich. Mr. Kuhn, thank you for joining us again, and we look forward to tonight's presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I hope I get the sound right. I'm not sure where all the echoes are going to show up. Michael, pull me aside if I get it wrong. Thank you for inviting me and members of the council, Madam Clerk, and Mr. City Manager. I'm here this evening to bring you the results of the exercise that we've all been participating in for the last several months, including the community. And we wanted to bring you the results of the prioritization of the goals that were developed during the strategic planning workshops and your input and your ranking sheets. And tonight, what we wanted to do is review the process for the benefit of everyone and for those that aren't here this evening, highlight the results of the goals and the ranking exercise process, and then in many ways try to wrap up this phase of the project with a discussion at the council's pleasure about next steps and, in our mind, in the model that we typically would use or any community would use. You have to take the goals and put them into action. So if you don't mind, I'd like to review the process with everyone. Then illustrate and highlight the results of the ranking exercise, and then entertain some discussion, and then move on to action planning if you so desire. So the slide that's up on the screen right now, and members of the council and staff have copies of this handout. It's a brief handout. This is the process overall that we have been walking through for the last several months. So I'm going to begin on the left side of the model. You see there's a wheel at the upper left-hand side, and below that wheel, you see some shaded areas, and it's kind of a burnt orange color. I don't know if that's the University of Texas color quite or not, but or Oklahoma, but below that area, that segment of the wheel is called Scan the Environment. And that was a significant part of the project where the council and the staff invited the community to provide input into the process and share their ideas prior to the council going to the workshops and developing goals and walking through SWOT analysis and other pieces of our discussions. So we gathered stakeholder input, and at the retreat in the workshops, we asked the council and staff to look at the external environment. We also asked the council to revisit the mission of the city, which is continuing around the wheel. We asked council members to kind of share and express a vision of the future of the community during our exercises, continuing on the wheel. And then when you get to the right-hand side of the wheel, there's a red quarter of the wheel. It says develop goals. And if you remember, that was primarily the afternoon session of our last day. And that goal development process took a few more steps. So once all the goals were developed at the workshops, we worked with staff, and there were a few goals that we thought could be consolidated. They made sense. They fit together, a lot of the stormwater items, some downtown items. So we organized the goals and developed a ranking sheet that was distributed to council. And then council took the ranking sheet and provided their view of those goals, how they stacked up against one another within a matrix of time and complexity, which I will review in just a moment. So the exercise you took part in was to prioritize the goals. What we have this evening are the results of your prioritization and your input. The next step is a kind of a golden, or depending on the color on the projector up there, it says operationalize the goals. So we are on that top line, moving to the right of the circle, and that's the next step of the process as the organization as a whole would undertake. Now that the goals have been developed, they've been prioritized, now it's up to staff and the council to work together, and primarily the burden is being shouldered by staff here, is to operationalize. And at the turn, you see a larger circle called develop strategies. Strategies are everything from the nuts and bolts of it to the policy side of the question, resources, which can include everything from money, time, and experts or people. And once your strategies are developed, staff would then develop action steps. Those would be implemented over time. Again, the goals we develop are right now broken up into a matrix, into 4 quadrants. They would implement the action steps as appropriate based on the timeline. And the next step, as you move across to the left, heading back toward the circle again, is to monitor the goals, monitor the progress that's made, and you may even have some performance measures assigned to the goals. Some lend themselves very easily to performance measures, some may not. But that brings you all the way back to the beginning. And this is intended to be a cyclical process. So at a certain interval, in fact, we even talked about it at our workshop, at some point the council and the staff should get together again and revisit and update the goals. So that's the process that we followed from the beginning of the project to where we are today, with a few steps yet to go. I mentioned, and you might remember this from our workshop, this is the time and complexity matrix that all the goals that were developed fit within one of these 4 quadrants. And if you remember, when we developed the goals, the first thing we did is we put them on a time continuum, short or long term. So to remind everyone, or those that weren't there, short-term goals are generally items that we felt should either be accomplished or initiated in the next 2 to 3 budget cycles. And in the government world, depending on when these workshops happen, 2 budget cycles may or may not be quite enough, but if you didn't budget for it this year, you're going to have to budget for it next year, and then implementation would take place. So short term is generally a 2 to 3 year window. Long term is anything beyond that. And in our conversations at the workshops, we discussed kind of a 3 to 7 year horizon. You get beyond 7 years, it doesn't mean something on here may not be in an 8 or 9 year horizon, but I think the world becomes a little fuzzy much beyond 7. So those are the contexts that we were all operating under. And again, as this illustration shows, this is a model and technique developed by Professor Jerry Gabris, who just retired this week at NIU. All the goals live within one of these quadrants. So the city does not have one ultimate overarching goal other than the things we expressed in your mission statement and so forth. You have a number one goal within each one of these quadrants. So you have multiple goals, working themselves through the process as the years unfold. The reason for prioritization is that no organization, can work on everything at once. We don't do it in our households. It's difficult to do it in a business environment, and the city is no different. So in this case, you do have 4 number 1 goals within each quadrant, 4 number 2s, 4 number 3s, etc. So what are the results? I know this isn't overly easy to read, so we do have paper copies at the dais. But this is an illustration that depicts your results within each of those 4 quadrants. So with your permission, Mr. Mayor, I would like to highlight the top 3 goals within each quadrant. Thank you. And then we have some of the detail behind if there's any interest in that. So at the very top of the sheet here, you see short-term complex. And the number 1 short-term complex goal that resulted from everybody's input and ranking that participated in the ranking step was to complete stormwater advancement projects. And I think if you take into account all the discussions we had, the focus group input we had, to me as a observer of all the discussions, I think this seemed to tie in nicely with some of the conversations and discussions that have been going on, not only in the last few months, but prior to that here in Elmhurst. The number 2 goal was to complete or substantially complete the Hahn Street project. The number 3 short-term complex goal was to refine stormwater plan options and develop a fiscally viable Plan B. So the one thing I haven't mentioned to this point is we talked about the time continuum, short-term, long-term. The other axis on the matrix is complexity, and that was whether something was considered routine or complex. And if you recall the definition we used, routine in this environment is not meant to be easy. A lot in our conversation we might use the word routine and use it as a pseudonym for easy or easily done. Routine in our definition for this process was things the city can do within the resources that it has available. Staff resources, time resources, maybe some fiscal resources, etc. Complex items are items that required extraordinary resources or measures, which typically would include cooperation or the sharing of a goal with another unit of government. It would be sharing of a goal that might be with a private developer, perhaps, or the private sector. Complex goals are items that would require extraordinary financial resources that the city would not have on hand. A complex goal was something that would require extraordinary experts, architects, engineers, attorneys, or you may require some special legislation or a referendum or something of that nature. So my apology for not touching on that earlier. Okay, so at the top was short-term complex. At the bottom of this model, short-term routine. So we're still working within that 2 to 3 year time frame. The short-term routine goal number 1 was to continue to implement and refine stormwater policies, regulations, and approaches. Number 2 was to develop an enhanced public information and communication plan for the city's key initiatives. Number 3 was to undertake a financial trend analysis and contingency plan for revenue changes and possible contraction of intergovernmental revenues. In my apology, I just saw a typo there. There's a missing N. Well, there isn't on that copy, just on mine. That's good for you, and I guess I pulled my working copy. So here again, you see stormwater rose to the top of the goals. The second was the discussion of an enhanced communication plan, and if you recall our conversations at the workshops, there was some discussion about being able to share information. And in fact, when we were walking through and developing goals and going through some of our SWOT analysis, there was discussion about how can we have people have a better or faster or a more complete understanding of the things we're working on. So this fits within those discussions. And the financial trend analysis, as you know, and Marilyn knows, that right now in the state of Illinois, revenue sources for almost any unit of government that has a relationship to the state are somewhat in flux. I'll put it that way. So those are your short-term goals, top three. On the long-term side, long-term routine, which would be on the left side of the model, number one was to conduct long-term tax and revenue diversification analysis. Keep your finance department and finance experts busy. Number two, as part of a zoning and planning update, take steps to minimize the frequency of variances and process change requests. And number three, on the long-term routine side, was to expand technology and police services, including security cameras and other technological advancements. On the other side, here to the right, our long-term complex, number one, was to complete additional stormwater mitigation projects. Number two was to work to identify and attract a destination anchor tenant for downtown to enhance and strengthen the downtown area. And number three was to work towards successfully attracting an industrial anchor tenant for your industrial park. So that's the collective view of all of you that participated in the ranking exercise. And the additional sheets, I'm going to step away from the, oops, I'm sorry, Mike. And you can see what we have are the tally sheets and the averages that represent the scoring from everybody's input. So if you might remember our discussions when we broke up during the workshop and on the ranking sheet, this is what we call a forced ranking exercise, which simply asked everyone to take all the items within each quadrant and rank them against other items only within this time and complexity quadrant. So these are the results of your rankings, and the instructions were for the item you want to be number one within this category, please give it a 1 and continue downward, a 2, a 3, a 4, so forth. So for this particular category that's showing right now, these are short-term complex goals. If you look at an average of 2.2, that's pretty high. That's indicating a pretty high consensus view of where these items fall. And in fact, if you look at your top three, you have a 2.2, a 3.80, a tie, a 3.80, and then we jump to a 5, then some 6s, there's some ties, et cetera. So I think what you see here are all the goals we developed, and as I've mentioned in conversations that day and in conversations since with staff, all the things that we developed during that session are captured here, and you saw them on the ranking sheets. It's just that how and when the city devotes its time and resources to these items is going to be dependent on accomplishing those that are perhaps higher on the list. One thing I did want to mention in general, for example, if something were to come up here, let's say it's goal D, 8.77, undertake and complete a feasibility study for a community activity and recreation center. Let's say the city were provided some kind of external funding to do that, and you only had 12 months to do it. This list should not, be interpreted to say, oh, well, we can't do that because it's number 7 or 8 down on the list. I mean, your judgment, your decision-making is certainly at play at all times here, but this should be your guide. And as I like to say, and as other groups I've worked with, you know, the idea of the list is to help provide you and the organization a sense of discipline in addressing these, because there will be temptations that may not be as dramatic as someone, you know, wanting to pay for a study as you. So I say, you know, be cautious. If you choose to move some things around as the next year or two unfolds, you know, they should be part of thoughtful discussions, I think, is the end result here. But I think this should be very helpful for everyone to be able to see, you know, how you kind of looked at the work that you did within each of these goal categories. And I'll step over the podium. Sorry, Mike, I won't hit you this time. We have the same results for the other categories. Short-term routine. Again, you can see there was pretty good consensus with a 2.13 average for the number one goal. And obviously, if there are fewer goals within a category, you're not going to see the list elongated. You're not going to see high numbers at the bottom. That's just by virtue of the number of goals that are within the category. Here are long-term complex goals. Again, stormwater at 2.2. There was a pretty good consistency at that level. And long-term routine, again, these numbers are low because there are only a few long-term routine goals that were identified. So for the moment, Mr. Mayor, I will stop there and be glad to help facilitate any further discussion or questions, or at your interest, we could talk about action planning when it's appropriate if you would like.
Okay. This really is the kind of the culmination of all those workshops we had done and then kicked it up to elected officials. You recall when we had this exercise about a month and a half ago, where we had you know, a couple of packets of information that was gathered from the public, and then we took it a step further and worked with Mr. Kuhn and his associate over 2 days, and he pulled this all together. And then you know, here's the rankings. I mean, ultimately, it's really data that prioritizes our thinking. And a big chunk of it's going to be moving forward in city staff. But is there any questions with what we've been presented with so far? Alderman Levin.
Well, you know, when I look at it, particularly presented as it is on the, whatever you call it, with the bubbles here, yeah. You know, it's kind of interesting that we have 12 goals and 4 of them are stormwater related, which you call rising, which I understand. But I feel like there might be some repetitiveness because it is, to my, based on my recollection, it was clearly the most important overall issue or goal that came out of our planning group. But I feel like it's, it can't be fully, you know, a third of our goals for, you know, the city. And I feel like some of them might be duplicative or maybe should be consolidated, like it's taken up too much. And I think it's also partly because the way it's broken out policy-wise as it goes to one committee, I just feel like it maybe needs some adjustment on that regard.
Well,
If I could, yeah, I think it's a good observation, and in some ways, one of the things when we worked on consolidating goals, and we worked with the city manager on these, is that one of my rules in this process and technique is not to move things around from categories. So when we were all together at the workshop, if we as a group put something up in a short-term complex area, you know, my approach is to leave it in that area. Now there were other, if you recall those, when we had the flip charts up and everyone was reciting goals, we did have several stormwater items, and what we did is we did try to collapse those so they didn't keep showing up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so to speak. But I think part of the results here is a reinforcement of the importance of it. And you're right, they are interrelated, and I think that's when we get to the next step where staff, when you start to operationalize them, whether it's complex or routine, but I would just say with these 2 items, looking at the manager, with stormwater being at the top of both complex and routine items and short term, then when staff goes to their work to kind of break this open and put it back apart, I think that's where those steps you know, would take place of further collapsing these. And I think that's the benefit of having the long list, is if you consider it and interpret it that way, then you just keep marching down the list on what's next and what's next. But I think it's a good observation. But it is, I think, reflective of a lot of the conversations and the things we heard in our data gathering.
Any other questions or comments? Alderman Toledo, and then I'll go to Alderman Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A question, kind of a process question really for us as a council and Mr. Kuhn for, input and how you've seen other folks. I appreciate the 1 through 3 kind of summary ranking. How do we as a council want to proceed forward? 3 is an arbitrary number. We
Right.
could say, we have enough time and resources and whatnot to go down to whatever it may be. I want to make sure that I'm not walking out of the meeting today and we're saying we're going to do 3, and then we've all agreed to that, and I would like to have more discussion about that and understand how we would evaluate that over time and come to that answer. Thank you.
Yeah, a big part of that's going to be implementation, and a lot of that rests on city staff. How after we go over this data, how city staff breaks it down, how Jim assigns it. I was talking to Mr. Kuhn earlier, preparing for this meeting, about how long it takes. We'll get into that in just a little bit. What our expectations as a council, now that we've kind of summarized the priority for the town, or for the city, starting with the greater input from everybody and kind of coming up to this pyramid. Now that we have this, and I agree, I think the top 3 goals is just a way to kind of tackle it now for conversation. But we certainly have all the rankings, and I think that staff is going to they're going to come up with a plan, a rough draft, let's say. I'm going to say 3 months, but I haven't talked to Jim about it yet, but in a short amount of time, and we'll have input along the way. So, yeah, by no means is just because it goes to 3 doesn't mean number 4 is not the next on the list. So, Alderman Dunn?
Yeah, just a clarification question. I know we wrote a lot of goals down when we were in our planning session. They were all, to confirm, they were all rolled up into this list. None fell off due to lack of interest or
No.
excitement? Okay, so
Everything that we shared, other than our consolidation exercise, where we took things that just were naturally an extension of a thought or were linked together, somewhere in the economic development area, somewhere in the stormwater area, but working with the city manager, I mean, my technique too is to resist the temptation of consolidating everything into a little tiny list unless, there's a process, because I try to respect, the input we all had when we were together.
Any other comments or questions? Alderman Bram?
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you. To kind of tail off of Alderman Toledo's comments, I look at the bubble chart as more of a summary, not the top 3 necessary, even though it states it's the top 3 goals in each of the time and complexity matrix. I think both of those, the time and the complexity, is what's key here. And just because they rose to the top because of the council said these are our priorities, that doesn't mean that, at least from my perspective, my recommendation to the city manager would be that's not where we put all our effort. It depends on how complex and how time sensitive and how routine each of these goals are, and that's where you're really going to see what rises to the top. I mean, for an example, the short-term complex goals, number 2 is complete the Hahn Street project or substantially complete this project. Well, it's already on its way. There's not much more for us as a council to do. To me, that's a low-hanging fruit. So there's really nothing to do on that. So I wouldn't even count that as something for the city manager to prioritize or to tackle in the next, since it's a short-term goal, 2 or 3 years. So I think those 2 variables is really what defines it. The bubble page, to me, is just a summary, not really a top 3 necessarily. It's really when the rubber hits the road and what bubbles up with those 2 big variables in each of them.
Okay. Alderman Wagner? Oh. Alderman Levin?
Well, the comment on Hahn Street, I was kind of thinking was complex, and I guess it's not so much for the council, but I suspect, because this is really a combined staff council, because there may be complexities left on the staff side to get Han Street moving forward. So is that, your goals are built in too from the staff level?
Yeah. Just so everyone's clear, only the elected officials participated in ranking the goals, just so everyone understands that. Yeah, as far as the Han Street goes, yes, there's still some detail left in that one to make sure that we finish it up, but I think Alderman Bram, I think the point was that once we start moving on a goal, that means we can, and it's going in the right direction, that means we can proceed to the next one. And as opportunities present themselves or resources present themselves, that may mean we move to a different goal as we go down the list.
Okay. Any other comments or questions? Alderman Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You know, I just want to highlight, you know, what we saw in the citizen survey. And, you know, I think what came out of the citizen survey and what's here is dead on. You know, what people like most about it, about living in Elmhurst that we can affect is the quality of life. There's definitely aspects to this, and the two things that come about of where people see problems or they like least are taxes and stormwater management. Well, the tax piece is what we're doing for, I would call, economic maintenance and then economic development. So we're putting those two things right up the top. Stormwater was what, 50-some% of the residents said was our biggest problem. So we're working on that. I think these two things come together very nicely. We're listening to what our constituents are saying, and we're putting together an action plan to address those things.
Okay. Any other comments? Mr. Kuhn or Mr. Grabowski, I think you want to share next steps with the council. I don't know who wants to go first. I mean, Mr. Kuhn, you can explain how, I know there's more than one way to move forward and how other communities you worked with have moved forward, and then I know Mr. Grabowski has some thoughts as it's Elmhurst specific.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. So action planning is the next phase, and all the conversation this evening fits in well with the idea of taking these policy goals, policy aims, et cetera, and putting them into action, or the word we use, mechanical word we use is called operationalizing them, which is, what does it mean? You know, and for staff, what kind of resources does it mean? So action planning is that fundamental process, as the slide here says, for management's approach to apply resources to make the goal happen. And, you know, that's part of the reason that you have the staff and the professionals on hand that you do. There are basically three main ingredients to action planning. One is you have to identify a goal, and that's where we are as we stand here today. The next piece is, what are your available or required resources? And again, that's a broadly defined view of resources. People, time, financial resources, could be political resources. Resources come in a wide array. And the next question is desired time frame. So the council has given some broad direction on time frame. We use two dimensions, short and long term. But for staff, they need to take those time frames and put them and break them down into actionable, you know, time sequences. And I have some illustrations that might help with that. But these primarily, and you know, this applies private sector, public sector. This is kind of fundamental decision making, fundamental action planning. What are the action steps? First, you know, is operationalizing the goal. And so for staff, that small bullet point underneath there, it says, what does goal X or X1 or X2, whatever goal it is, what does it really mean? And I've done a fair amount of work with staffs on this, and literally we get into a room, we spend a half a day, a couple of half days, we'll go through all these goals, and now it's your professional's responsibility to take that goal and say, well, what does it really mean? You know, I don't want to pick on the finance director since he's sitting right here, but if you're going to do some long-term financial planning, it's part of the finance director's responsibility to share with the manager and the rest of the management team exactly what that's going to mean. And I would say from, you know, past experience, it's not only the revenues that might be generated, but a lot of this is driven by need and expenses, and a lot of elements that every community deals with are capital items and long-term sustainability plus day-to-day services. So the discussion would be, well, what does it really mean if we're going to do a financial plan? And so the finance director would share with the rest, well, here's how I see it happening, and there would be a dialogue. And that would happen and again, for most groups, we work, and this is it's obviously an approach that varies, but one of the techniques that I like to suggest to groups is work in tiers. Tier 1, almost to some of the comments the group made. Tier 1 goals, Tier 2, Tier 3, and you can start to see some of the breakpoints in the scoring, et cetera, but you need to kind of have that discussion, whatever the item is, and that's where the pros sit in a room, and they'll actually use each other for ideas and input. The next is structural assignments. Who's going to be responsible? And again, this sounds like a pretty perfunctory and straightforward item, but in a large organization or some of these goals overlap. There are different departments and different functions that are going to be working on them. Someone needs to be in charge and be a point person. So again, the idea here is, for the management team to work through that and someone to take the lead on certain items. And then scheduling. You start to mark down target dates. And this is not meant to be something that's hard and fast, that if you get to September 30th and something isn't completed, that everything will come to an end. But I think if you got to next September 30th, if you got to July or January and something wasn't done that you needed an essential piece, this comes along with accountability. What are some of the target dates? And this information, it's helpful to communicate back to your committees or other parts of the city council that are involved at a closer level on some of these. Then you can start to see how this might unfold. And the benefit for staff is start to identify where things intersect, or where things overlap, or where things pile up, because now you can start to identify barriers. You can start to identify a constriction in resources. It's like, well, we have this one person assigned to the 4 top goals. How can that be? Next, from scheduling becomes action steps, and this is literally taking a goal down and breaking it down to whatever detail you think would be helpful, and primarily the burden would fall on the person who would be the point person for a particular goal, or there might be a team of people, but now it's, you start to ask yourself, well, how will the goal be accomplished? What are the resources that are needed? What budget cycle might this have to fall in? Is outside expertise required? Some of these things are what we discussed, as we were kind of going around the table at the workshop. Last item would be performance measures. And, that's something that every organization that I know of in local government, performance measures are something that are very central to being able to track items, but every organization takes their own approach on performance measures. The idea here is, how would you measure success? And that's a broader conversation, but at least in action planning, you can start to envision how might you be able to share with everyone, well, we accomplished that. So you've mentioned already tonight the HAN project. It would be what is the actual, detailed thing when you say, boom, it's done, we can check it off. Or, for some of these projects are ongoing, you can check off a significant piece of it, et cetera. And you've been through this, your engineering work, your parking deck work. I mean, first you have to find a site, then you have to design it, then you have to fund it. So there are kind of what I call milestones. And lastly, I only have 2 more slides, and then I'm going to stop talking. This is a blank action planning worksheet. This is the technique that I've used with groups. You can see it's very, very sophisticated, but you know what? It works. And there are different variations on this. You can do what you want. But on the left-hand side of the sheet, there you see the left-hand column. It says, what's the project or action? What's the priority level? Moving to the right. Who's the primary lead? Is there a secondary staff member or department? What are the tasks? What's the role of the village or the city here? I mean, in some cases, if you're working with IDOT or something, you may have the launching point, but then you kind of have to stand back and monitor. So we try to ask staff members to identify that. Are there other outside participants or experts? What's the potential funding source? Is it the general fund? Is it a special fund? Is it a special revenue? And then, what's the action or duration of the schedule? 12 months, 24 months, 6 months, 90 days. And then there's an initiation date, and then key status date number 1, key status date number 2, and then any other review dates. These can be modified. This is just simply an idea, but you can see, you know, it's kind of the heart and soul of trying to put something down and say, how are we going to tackle this? There are a lot of variations. This is not the only way by any stretch. The other thing I just had as an illustration, this is an example from a project that was done about 3 or 4 years ago. I know it's fuzzy and you can't read it quite well. We're calling it Anyville 2012, but you know, and this one page, if you look on the left-hand side, the second column says priority level. This page contained all this communities, what they called Tier 1 priorities. And they walked themselves all the way across these particular goals, and they went through the exercise of sharing with each other, what are we going to do, what's the time frame, when's the action date, et cetera. So again, this is food for thought. There are many ways to do this. I've seen organizations do it, you know, in a number of ways. I actually had a county that I worked with here in Illinois, and after they went through the process, they actually set up a task force that was responsible for monitoring progress. They developed an action plan, and they actually had an internal web page that they were able to update people on. But I'm not saying that's necessary. I also know a community here in the Chicago area. The city manager has long retired, but he had a system where in the old days, I'm sure the city, do you still have mailboxes here at City Hall, or is everything? They had the key goals up above the council members' mailboxes, and you could see these key dates and key thresholds, and when they were met, it was simply a whiteboard kind of a thing. You know, it's whatever works. That's what I say to any group I work with. Whatever you think is going to help you put these into action, I'm all for it. Some of it is going to be routine, kind of. It might be spread around among committees, but I would say to the city manager, and he already knows this, you know, now the thing is the transfer of the baton goes to staff. Staff needs to come up with some strategies for you, and there are a lot of ways to do it. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions in general about what Mr. Kuhn presented before I go to City Manager Grabowski? Alderman Bram.
Thank you. Just a quick question, and it's the piece about scheduling. You know, long-term versus short-term. From your experience, what is the refinement? To me, long-term, what we would try to accomplish from when we talk about scheduling would be what year. Short-term, maybe what quarter, or maybe what month if we're really good and confident. But is that what you've seen in the past when it comes to scheduling for long-term goals, maybe what year we're targeting versus short-term, a quarter?
Right, particularly at this initial stage. So the first pass around for a long-term goal, you might identify what year you'd like to see it happen. And then if you back into it, what are some of the key steps that we want to do this 12 months? And in some cases, you may not have much at all to do this 12 months, or in others, if in 12 months, you know, you wanted to see a new building happen, or you know, some communities out in the green belt, you know, if you wanted to have new sewer lines put in 5 years from now, there's a lot of work that has to get done before you get to that 5-year mark. So, yes, generally, for the long terms, you want to say, okay, what year are we kind of envisioning this happening, and then backing up. But for some of them, some long terms, you may want to take some steps today, start to identify if you need an outside expert, like an engineer or an architect, if you need to acquire land. Let's say there was some project where the city needed to actually acquire land. You know, if you want to see something happen 5 years from now, you know, you may need to start working on land acquisition this year or next year. So it does have elasticity, and that's where the judgment comes in.
Alderman Dunn?
Just wondering, there's a lot of goals and projects, initiatives, and they will involve city staff, committees, external stakeholders. As far as who's the champion for the whole plan, would that be our city manager? So city manager will be tracking accountabilities, and if we slip on any of those. Okay.
Alderman Levin?
You know, in terms of the steps, I think you have to reverse the third and fourth. I don't think you can do scheduling till you know what your action steps or work plans are, because that would assume that you have unlimited resources. So until you know how it's going to be accomplished, what we need to do, what it's gonna cost, what outside help is required, how can you schedule? Because if it's unlimited resources, you schedule it and then you'll just make it happen. But since I think we don't have unlimited resources anymore, I think we need to, reverse that.
Yeah, the scheduling, I call it, it's a very dynamic process because you have to, I would suggest to the staff, you have to take into account a lot of variables. What else is in front of you? What might have been presented that you didn't plan for? The chief and I were talking before the meeting, there could be a disaster, in the community that might throw something on this list off because it just simply is going to take precedent. But scheduling, I think it begins with that large target and then work yourself back. And I would say, in my experience, that's when staff's dynamic starts to talk about it and said, well, we can't have all these things happen and come do it once. I mean, I've seen that happen in many of these exercises. There's that initial eagerness, and then all of a sudden you put it on a calendar and go, well, wait a minute, everything can't be done on, March 2016. It's just not going to happen. So that's a very good point. I see it as a dynamic, whether you do the scheduling first or your steps first, that's kind of a recipe for, those are the conversations I think need to take place before you develop any kind of a grid or a time frame.
Alderman Toledo.
This is a follow-up, thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is a follow-up to Alderman Dunn's question. For a point of clarification, I thank Mr. Grabowski for taking the weight of the strategic plan on his shoulders and championing that. I'm curious how the council can support you in your efforts and the staff in your efforts in terms of, staying on track, prioritization questions that may occur, et cetera, status updates over time. Is that something that you foresee going through committees to support you in that way, or have you thought through that and maybe you have an answer at this time and maybe you don't have an answer at this time?
Go ahead, Jim.
Thank you. That was going to be part of my comments as far as how we move forward here. Before I get to that, though, I sincerely want to thank everyone for their input to this. This is something that I think most here know was on my to-do list, and I'm glad that we're at the point that we're at. I appreciate all the input that the focus groups gave us as well. I think that was valuable for the council to review. So now that we're here, what I would like to do is sit with Greg and staff for a little bit and go through all of this so we can all kind of digest it together. We have not had a chance as staff to sit down and really talk through this. We sent it out last week, and certainly people have had a chance to review it. So what I'd like to do, and according to everyone's schedules, is get together and talk through that and use Greg for a little bit in the short term here to really get to this eventually. And once this is put together, come back to the council. It would be before budget time. And then that's going to be the primary way that the city council will be able to support these is the resources in the budgeting. As we break them down to individual staff members and responsibilities, it's anticipated that the committees will be involved because typically there are approvals that will have to go through committees on the city council for different items. So the committees will be involved that way. And as Greg had mentioned earlier, we'll put some sort of visual schedule up, whether it's an internal site or external on the website, as far as tracking it and where things are and how we're proceeding along to the different goals so that everybody can view it, similar to the way that the museum is doing with their strategic plan.
Great. Thank you.
Alderman Branham.
Thank you. In regards to the city manager's comments, I guess my recommendation would be, before we get to this, we being the staff essentially, get to this detail, I think it would be beneficial for, I guess a rough draft, if you would, to be shared with the council so we could be providing feedback along the way so we're not at the close to the 11th hour of seeing this right before budget cycle and then having questions and concerns at that time and maybe asking for priorities to be rearranged or why this one is set with this date, et cetera. So my recommendation would be, yes, I love the idea of having this online for accessibility, but maybe make this as a routine presentation, a 5-10 minute presentation during council meetings to update the council as well as the public at large.
Okay. Alderman Deuter.
Thank you, Mayor. I just have a question. Will you mentioned kind of that these may naturally fall into a tier 1, tier 2, and down the line. Will each goal that's reflected in the list here be broken down into these action steps, or do you just initially take the top half of the list, or how far down do you go?
You know, it's a great question, and it happens in every one of these exercises. I think that's where the staff typically, and perhaps the manager in consultation with the council or committees. I think the idea here is not to make this into an onerous exercise, because I think what can happen too is the exercise can become the goal. And I don't think we want that to happen. So I think you have to find a manageable way to do it that's reasonable and responsible. But I think I have worked with communities where, you know, they went tier 1 and tier 2, and then the tier 3s, they said, we're not going to action plan those right now. They're still there, they're still on the list, but we're not going to action plan them yet. We're going to spend our time here, and then tracking and so forth. And I've seen tracking take a lot of different flavors and forms. Quarterly updates are generally something. It may be if the city manager prepares a memo before agenda weeks, and whatever the manager's technique is. Sometimes they appear in there. Sometimes this kind of a document might come out a couple times a year. I mean, there's a lot of elasticity here, but your primary question was, should we plan out everything? And I would say most of the groups I work with, they do not go down all the way, you know, to the bottom tier of the goals. They try to keep, you know, again, something that's relatively manageable. But it is a little bit of an interpretation. So I would leave, maybe the manager has some thoughts on that.
I would also add that, you know, as much as this is going to be, it's good that this is going to give, this is direction that's given to city staff, and you know, they're going to try to put it together the best they can, some sort of an action plan. I think it's important. So as much as we're going to hold their feet to the fire, we need to kind of do that to ourselves as well. We need to respect the priorities that we put in place. That doesn't mean that 6 months from now something's going to crop up, and I think that's kind of what I'm hearing from a lot of people here is staff and City Manager Grabowski are aware that we're a very active council, and there's 14 of us, there's not 7 of us. So we're going to want to see some flexibility, recommendations from staff, how we handle stuff. And talking to Mr. Kuhn as we're going through this process, it's not like the 14th goal on this list is a bad idea. They're all pretty good ideas. But we do have to, at least in the short term, we did a lot of work to get to this point. We do have to respect the priorities that really this council has established, starting with grassroots from the residents all the way up. So we're at this point. You know, I would encourage everyone to do this. I actually took my original rankings that I submitted to staff, and I lined them up against here. And I got to tell you, you know, it was kind of an interesting exercise, but I would say in the top 5, I think all my top 5 were about the same. You know, 2 might be where 3 is, or 3 might be where 2 is. But I was encouraged by that, and I'm hoping that the rest of the folks here, if they did that, would come up with the same results and realize, you know, I'm looking at what is the short-term complex goals, and we've got 13 or 14 items on this. But I'd be pretty encouraged if we all went through it and we kind of agreed on the top 5. So as much as this puts an onus on city staff to figure out how to make this work, I think we got to make sure that we give city staff a little flexibility, and we don't pull 14 out of the bottom and say, what are you doing about this? It doesn't mean it's not important, but there is a time where we have to prioritize, and there are a limited number of resources, you know, whether it's staff or money. So, I mean, like I said, it was an interesting exercise to do it again for myself. So, any other additional comments? City Manager Grabowski, anything you want to add?
Nothing, thank you.
We're looking forward to at least an update on your implementation ideas, maybe some timing, give you a couple of weeks, but then come to us and let us know. And then I think you heard from a lot of folks here, which should be no surprise to you, that there's going to be some continued input and comments as you go through this. So we look forward to doing that and helping staff and ultimately the city of Elmhurst. So Any other comments? Alderman Bram?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if what we saw here, the two presentations, will be on the city website for the public to access as well.
Good question.
Yes, we can put that up.
Thank you.
Okay, any other comments or questions? I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Motion by Alderman Mulliner, second by Alderman Dunn. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Aye, opposed? We're adjourned. Thank you, Mr. Kuhn, for your
Thank you.
help.